Dude, what am I even thinking? Putting Venn diagram in the title of a video, that's not gonna get clicked. I'll change it in a couple days, don't worry about it. So, in January, I made a video where I talked about game design concept of power creep for a little while, and this is kind of a follow-up on that, talking about specific relationship between power creep and the concept of feature creep, because based on the comments, there's some elaboration I can do on that front, because I realized that the statement I made is pretty controversial without diving into the nuance behind why I make it. I refer to feature creep as a concept where a game piece does more things than a previous game piece, without being more powerful numbers-wise as feature creep, and while it's also one example and also one of the more clear-cut examples of when feature creep is power creep. But I think by focusing on that, I accidentally implied that feature creep and power creep are always the same thing, when you can very well have one without the other in a lot of situations. And I want to talk about a few different ways that feature creep happens and how they both can and can't equate to power creep. Most of my examples are going to be from MTG cards, thus the arena gameplay, but I'll be sure to talk at least somewhat about some of the games that you guys are more into me talking about. This concept is just easier to speak on when speaking MTG terms. Some of my examples are going to directly relate to a comment thread on the original video. Shout out to KindleSmith80 for the discussion that helped fuel this idea of how to approach this video. So the first example is what I just talked about, the more literal increase of a card's number of features. I want to point out my example from the thumbnail in the original video for this, but modify it a bit, the reason for which is going to be explained further along. 3 steps ahead and cancel. The best way to look at how these cards compare is to look at both of them for what it costs you to counter target spell. 1 generic and 2 blue. When you're doing this with the 2 spells, then they are of equal power level, but that's where feature creep comes in. 3 steps ahead can do other things. If you have enough mana, you can even add effects to it, including countering a spell. There's other cards you could compare 3 steps ahead to for its other modes, but those comparisons are already less direct, and being as direct as possible with this is, well, kind of part of the point. So when including 3 steps ahead in your deck, it can fill the role of a counter spell in the exact same way that cancel can, but because of the other things that 3 steps ahead can do, it is a more powerful game piece. This is an example of when feature creep is power creep. However, if we were to compare 3 steps ahead to what I put in the thumbnail to compare it to, counterspell, it skews less on the side of power creep because costing 1 less mana may be more powerful than having the other features when they're strictly being used for the counterspell functionality. Counterspell is more powerful, but if having the mana open later in the game is relevant, then 3 steps ahead might be more powerful. There's no denying that 3 steps ahead has more features than counterspell, but the change in mana cost to do the basic action does make how much power creep is involved a lot more subjective. And this is a big challenge to bring up with gacha games, because most of the time, this form of power creep really takes the form of a character who can serve multiple different roles on a team. But, you know, Farina from Genshin Impact is probably a good example when it's not power creep, since Farina actively has to choose between healing and doing off-field damage instead of being a character that happens to always be able to do both. In Wuthering Waves, Phoebe is very similar, choosing between Absolution and Confession mode to either serve as a primary unit taking advantage of Spectral Frazzle or being the primary unit applying it. Of course, then you get another means by which feature creep can set in, and not only is it not power creep, but it's actually the opposite. This is when a game piece has more features, but those features are there to restrict, most likely for something that may be more powerful in a different specific way. The example I'm going to provide here is actually really old school: Ancestral Recall and Brainstorm. Both of these spells cost a single blue and let you draw 3 cards. While Ancestral Recall can target the other player if you want, that's not really super relevant to the difference between these cards I want to talk about, because Brainstorm's other part of the effect, requiring you to put 2 cards back after you've drawn, serves as the way in which feature creep is directly being used to power down a card rather than power it up. This is actually something MTG has done with a number of Power 9 cards. One of the cards that got banned in Commander last year, Jeweled Lotus, is a similar form of feature creep, where an added restriction is placed in order to balance the card. And when it comes to gacha games, this tends to be something players don't like, because most of the time, any additional features that restrict are actually simplifying what you can do with the character, rather than creating additional complexity, which is typically the point of feature creep as a term. And also tend to not be received well, which is probably part of the reason it's less common. Probably the best example of what I'm talking about in those specific terms would be Kokomi from Genshin Impact, who has minus 100% crit rate, or as I almost called it when recording this the first time, cringe rate. I kind of like that. Meaning, in theory, she should never, not ever, be able to crit, but her damage and healing are higher because she's designed with no longer interacting with the critical hit system in mind. It's kind of a double-edged sword, really. Objectively, it's less complex because there's one less thing you're interacting with, but because it's something you're much more used to interacting with, it feels more complex. I mean, that could be a video on its own, so I think I'll just kind of stop what I'm saying right here, but I hope I've made my point. Although that does bring me to my next point to bring up. I'm sure a lot of you have noticed how many of my examples come with a caveat of including multiple different metrics being changed. And there's a reason for that, which is another reason that power creep and feature creep can be linked while not necessarily being the same thing. I actually talked about this a bit more in that video, and in fact cite this as one of the main ways that power creep can disguise itself as only feature creep. I have, and likely will in the future, refer to this as turning multiple dials, and it's perhaps the aspect that got confused for me saying that all feature creep was power creep the most, rather than specific forms of it. In that comment that I was talking about before, the other person in the conversation referred to a 1-1 with haste in red and a 1-1 with flying in blue as an example of a comparison that displays feature creep, but that's not really true at all. Both of these cards really have the same number of features, with one being fast and the other being evasive. This actually relates to one of the concepts that they bring up with power creep as well. 1 mana being a 2 damage burn spell before, but 3 damage for a burn spell now, which actually isn't true. The first direct damage spell in the entire game, Lightning Bolt, is 3 damage. This is a concept that Mark Rosewater brings up when it comes to talking about power levels of cards, which I like to call the half damage rule, where if the numbers themselves don't provide enough leeway for what the power level of card should be, other restrictions or bonuses can be added to bring that card in line. I call it that because Morrow describes the average power level of a 1 mana burn spell to be 2.5 damage, but MTG doesn't deal in half damage, at least when they aren't joking, so you have other things to move when you want to make up that half damage. For example, an instant that deals only 2 damage may deal more damage under specific conditions, or a spell that deals 3 damage may come with additional costs or have more restrictions on what it can hit. A lot of this can also tie into how parasitic mechanics can be good for the game. You are able to make something more powerful by making it a more restrictive means by which that power can be achieved. This is actually one of the central design elements of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In that most cards are incredibly specific about what they work with, thus why the rules text on cards tend to be so long nowadays. There is one more concept I want to bring up too, and it's related to something that was said in the comment chain that I don't feel like accurately describes what we were talking about, but does make a good point. See, this person mentioned releasing a 1-1 in different colors to be an example of feature creep in MTG, but that's not really true either. It's not so much more features being added to the game, but rather taking the features that are already there and filling in blank space. It still brings up the idea, though, that players aren't necessarily using the term feature creep correctly, at least not from the same perspective that a game designer would be using the term. See, typically the term feature creep would be used more so from the perspective of the overall design of a game rather than from the perspective of an individual game piece. While game pieces can be part of that, it's more so that a game piece is added that interacts with an aspect of the game that previously was either not interacted with at all or interacted with very little. One of the best examples is the card type Planeswalker, introduced in Lorwyn and had its own mechanics for how they worked and modified the rules of attacking when they were on the board. Something they have in common with battles, but I'm not going to go into that because I'll probably make that video if and when they prove that this is actually something that they're going to use in the future, so that I have some game design concepts to actually fucking work with when talking about it, instead of just making assumptions. A more subtle example are the Eldrazi from Oath of the Gatewatch, specifically, that include symbols in their mana cost depicting colorless mana. Things previously didn't care about the mana you were spending, specifically having no color before now, and this creates a new feature in the game of the lack of one of the features mattering. This is another knob that can be turned in relation to power level without changing the numbers as well. So it allows new cards to be printed that have similar function to older cards without being more or less powerful than those older cards. This is the way a game designer talks about feature creep, as a method of controlling power creep by creating a new way for a new piece to change without being more powerful, but one that should also be controlled to prevent the game from becoming unfun by way of complexity rather than escalation. In the conversation players have, though, units being more or less powerful than one another is often discussed on an individual level rather than on a macro level, even if you're using the more individual points to speak to the overall health of the game. One character being more complex than a previous character is a complaint that people will cite, and this goes for TCGs as well, and it would seem very natural to call that feature creep because when you look at the words without the context of it being about a game designer looking at the whole game, it does make sense. Power creep also means something different to a game designer looking at the whole game because they'd be looking at the average power level of game pieces and not one if one piece is individually more powerful than the other. Although granted, if you have a consistent pattern of more pieces that are being released that are more powerful than the last, that is an example of power creep that applies to both. The example of having a 1/1 in each color being feature creep is like if you put a Bennett or a Yang Yang in every element in Genshin or Wuwa. If these units are doing the same thing, it's not feature creep. It's filling a space with something that already exists in a different space than where you're putting it now. The overall point of what I'm saying here is to point out that the overall point of that comment is correct. Feature creep and power creep are not the same thing, and you can have one without the other. There's definitely a large intersection between them though, because sometimes the result of adding more components to what you can do is that the numbers do go higher. And on reading that comment, I felt like going into more detail about what feature creep that is power creep can do to disguise itself as feature creep that isn't power creep, and that was something worth talking about. But what do you think? Do you have any examples of feature creep that isn't power creep that you'd like to talk about? What about the other way around? Examples of power creep that aren't feature creep? Let me know how my videos are yapping creep in the comments, and be sure to leave a like on your way out. But until next time, this is the effing Boonslayer signing out.